Okay, tonight we're going to talk about paints and pigments. But before we do, we have to get one thing cleared out. I want to talk about palette. A lot of people will come to you as an artist and say, what is your palette? What they're really saying is, what colors do you use for mixing? This is an old concept that goes back to the Renaissance. Now, for watercolors, I typically tell them it depends on the picture. And the reason for that is that watercolors, unlike any other medium, has characteristics that exhibit itself when you're painting. And we're going to talk about those characteristics, of which one color is just one of many of the characteristics. So we'll start by talking about the characteristics of watercolor. Okay, we're going to do the very basic of watercolor. Back in the old days, artists made their own watercolor. They made their own paint. And then as time went along, a guild came up, and these people called themselves colormen, and they made the paint for the artist. But in order to appreciate how far we've come, I want to show you how watercolors were really made at one time. First, you go out and you find yourself a pigment, basically a rock. And as you can see, these rocks here are different colors. So they would pick out one, like this is like a raw sienna here. Throw it in the mortar and pestle, throw a bunch of them in there, grind it up. This is hard work. Put a little gum arabic in there, and there you have your basic watercolors. The problem with it is that it'll start to flake if you don't put something else in there. So they came along, they put a little bit of honey in there. Now what this honey does, and you'll find it in some of the finer watercolors, is it allows it to cake, so you get pan watercolors. And they put other things in there too nowadays, like glycerin and things like that. Now, there's another thing, and I spoke to this earlier, they put in there, on occasion, some people do, some don't. This is called oxgall. And what that does, it allows your paint to flow a little more freely. But that's basically what watercolor is. Now, if you want to try, you can buy pigments, and you can mix your own stuff. But you're going to be inhibited by the characteristics of watercolor and how they handle on your paper. And you're going to be very limited. And to me, watercolors, the nice thing about them is they're so versatile and they're so diverse. You can be yourself with them. And particularly with all the watercolors that are out there today. So next I'm going to show you the different types of watercolors that you can use to achieve what you want to achieve when you're painting. What is watercolor? This is watercolor. These are the typical forms of watercolor that you'll find. Let me show you a couple. These are watercolor pencils. Beautiful. You can work with these. I work with them all the time. You can wet them down. You can spray them. Nice to work with. Pan watercolors. These are from when we were children, and they used to give us little pans, and you could paint from. This is a little more sophisticated set. But these work well too. You get a nice variety, reasonable price, and why not? You know, I use these too. Liquid watercolors. This is relatively new. I've used them on occasion, and they work. You know, they work differently than traditional watercolors, but they're nice. They're very intense. I mean, you can put down very intense colors with these liquid ones. The traditional watercolors typically come in tubes, and they have all the the technical data usually written on the tubes, unlike these other watercolors. This is primarily what I use is tube type watercolors, and not just this brand. I use other brands also. And another very new one that just came out within the past few years is watercolor crayons. Much the same as a pencil, except you can cover large areas, and then you wet it down, and there's techniques for that too. I haven't used these yet, but you can see all the forms of watercolor you get. Unlike any other media, it has a variety of things. It allows you a lot of freedom to do what you want to do when you want to paint. Paint characteristics. Before we start this discussion, we need to get rid of one thing, and that's what you'll find on most tubes of paint. You'll have a color index number here. That color index number, all it does for us, it tells us whether it's a single pigment or a multiple pigment paint. It really serves no other function other than that. You can have a color index number of many different shades and hues of the same color. It tells you nothing about the characteristics on how it handles and how it goes on your paper. So we'll talk about those that are relevant. First is light fastness or permanency. It's important in all colors and in all paints how light fast your color is. If it's going to be exposed to sunlight or anything like that, you want the most permanent color you can get. Fugitive colors, there's absolutely no need to use fugitive colors, and they're required to tell you whether a color is fugitive or not. And so that's number one consideration. Now, the rest of the considerations, you're going to need some kind of paper or data to understand your pigment. A lot of it is in catalogs when you order paint, and some of it you can ask for. And they'll always have the characteristics listed with some kind of coding in here. And we're going to talk about a couple of them. One, transparency. And that's self-evident. If you put it down, it's going to be transparent. Non-staining. If you're going to be lifting your paint at a later date, that's a consideration. Easy lift. That's another term. If you're going to be lifting, obviously that's later. Granulating color. That to me is sort of the opposite of transparent. And it's beautiful. If you put down a wash with granulating color, it turns out very nice. Semi-transparent. Semi-staining. Staining. That's what you want to use for all your underpainting if you underpaint. And knowing that once you put down a staining pigment, it's not going to come off there. You're not going to lift it, and it's there forever. So if you mess up, forget it. You either got to paint over it with an opaque, which is the next term, opaque. And there are a lot of earth colors that are opaque, and we'll get into specific colors later, and some of the whites and other colors like that. Hard lift, meaning that it's really not staining, but once you put it on there, the degree of the colors, how it was ground, how small the particles are, makes it harder to lift it, and it gets into the paper and stuff. And of course, there's a term they call intense also. Intense just means that you can use a little bit and go a long ways. A lot of the liquid ones I showed you like that. Now, these terms you will not find typically with the watercolor pencils or the crayons. You'll see it with pan colors, you'll see it with tube colors, and sometimes you'll see it with the liquid colors. These are all considerations that you need to take when you start to paint in watercolors, because they're all going to affect the outcome of your painting.